All right. Well, hey, thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. And Raquel and I are happy to talk to you about the Vision Resource Center today. And um, if you don't know who I am, I'm Dan Hall from Bakersfield College. I'm the academic technology director. And Raquel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I am Raquel Lopez and I am one of the program managers that oversees the Delano and also part of the rural um, initiatives team.
All right. Hopefully you have been able to access the Vision Resource Center. Hopefully you received the guide that I just sent out a little while ago. If you are not able to log in to the Vision Resource Center, that's okay. When we come to the time of exploring, I'll create a breakout room and you and I can meet and I can try to help you through that access issue that if you have that. Okay, well, let's see. Let's get the PowerPoint going. And all right, so hopefully you all have had experience with the Vision Resource Center, but there are, new people to our district all the time. And so they may not be aware, like Sandy Owens uh, just moved here to California, actually. And so she may not be aware of the Vision Resource Center. So, and many of you, maybe it's been a while since you've looked at some of the resources there. So hopefully this is a good refresher for you that hopefully will inspire you to take a second or third look at the Vision Resource Center. All right, so we will talk about why you might want to take advantage of the resources at the Vision Resource Center. And then we'll look at four categories of trainings that I've kind of grouped things in that you can see whether any of those categories apply to you. And then we'll talk about then we'll actually go into exploring on our own and have you share out some of the trainings that you've found that might be relevant to you or to your staff. So why use the Vision Resource Center? So first of all, it's a free professional development resource collection for you and or your staff. And so these trainings are available online. You can adjust the length of time uh, that you are willing to dedicate to the trainings. Um, you also might think of some of these trainings as targeting some performance deficiencies or skills gaps that your staff might have. You might use some of these trainings as as setting some goals for your staff. So I'd like you to complete, one of these trainings per month or whatever it might be that you decide on. You could include it as part of your performance review for your staff. So let's say you recognize that someone is having trouble in completing their projects on time. So maybe you might think, well, this person would benefit from a training on time management. And so you could, include that as part of your performance review for them that, they must complete this training, within the next month or 3 months or whatever. And then another possible idea is to have the staff take turns at your department meetings on a training that they uh, reviewed or completed for that month or that week or whenever, however often you have your department meetings. But take maybe 5 or 10 minutes and have the employee talk about what they found relevant to a particular training. Okay, well let's jump right into it, and we're going to look at these trainings in four different categories. First, we'll look at these trainings as they might address technical skills, and then we'll take a look at trainings devoted to soft skills, then trainings devoted to leadership, which leadership and soft skills do kind of overlap, but again, we'll focus on those leadership skills. And then maybe you need to increase your knowledge of the California Community College system, Sandy, uh, or other higher ed issues. And so this is a great way of tapping into those resources. So let me go then now to sharing my web page. Hi, Carla. Welcome. And so here then is the homepage of the Vision Resource Center. Hopefully you've all gotten there. And by clicking on Login Now, you will get this screen. And so you'll just use your district or your college email address, submit that. It'll take you to a sign-in, single sign-in authorization. And so that will connect you to our district. And so you'll use your district login and be able to access the Vision Resource Center. And it should come up with something like this. So this one is built especially for Bakersfield College. So Saracosa, you're going to look different. Your homepage is going to be different. District office is going to be different, and the Porterville College is going to be different. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to this hamburger menu on the upper right. We'll click on that, and you'll see all these different options. And you most likely see fewer options than these. But I will tell you that most of these options you can probably just ignore. There are communities that you could belong to. So I'll just divert real quick. So you could jump into some of these communities. I will tell you with the ones that I'm involved in, though, there's very little activity. And of course, I don't contribute to any of that activity, so I shouldn't really ding it for not being very active. But so you can join communities, but what we're going to take our time with today is in this learning option. So if you click on that, that's going to bring you more options. Raquel will talk about this My Transcript in a little bit, but what I want you to click on is this Learner Home. So again, your page is going to look different than this. On mine, it shows me the number of trainings I've completed, the number of hours I've devoted, any badges, any subjects that it thinks that I might be interested in. But let's take a look at first some of these technical skills that I talked about, that first category. So let's say that you or your staff need to learn about Excel pivot tables, what they are and how that can help you with your analysis. And so by typing that in, I get 226 results on pivot tables. Now, as you scroll down, you'll see that not all of them are appropriate for this subject that I typed in, but it'll get you close on quite a few of these training options. What I think is important is over here on this left side are the filters. So you can filter out trainings that are going to be more than 2 hours if you like. But let's say that you want to assign some of these trainings to some of your staff and you don't want it to take any longer than an hour. So if you select that, then now our results are filtered out down to 150 results. All right, then I wouldn't worry about this as much, but as long as the type is online class and online content, that's going to be trainings that will serve you well then. All right, so going down to subject. So many of these trainings are broken down into various subjects. within the Excel pivot table. And you can also limit the trainees by how well rated they are. So for me, I'm not going to mess with any trainings that are anything less than a 3-star rating. So Amazon has taught me well. Okay, then provider. This is another interesting thing where actually I'm going to take that off so I can get more providers here. I'm going to take that off. Okay, so now you'll see that the California Community College System and the Vision Resource Center has contracts with all these different providers to provide training videos. And some of my favorites are Grovo. Most anything with Grovo is going to be good quality. Skillsoft is also good. And as you sample these videos, you'll get a feel for, oh yeah, this particular provider is very solid. I can trust this provider to make a very relevant video. Okay, so given that, let's go back to our PowerPoint and just here. And so here are some potential search topics you might want to search in. Now, another technology skill that's extremely popular right now, for good reason, is AI usage. And so if you search for AI usage, you're going to get a ton of training materials on that. Now, but if you scroll down a little bit, below the top search results for AI, you're going to see any title that has the letter A and I next to it embedded in the title. So like, for example, you'll see trainings on first aid because there's AI in aid. So obviously you'll need to filter out which ones don't really pertain to you. But if you want to find out how to use AI to brainstorm subjects or outline a presentation or to improve your writing, or maybe there's a specific AI that agent that you want to get more familiar with, so you could search for trainings related to ChatGPT or Copilot. Let me look at chat here just for a minute. And can anyone spot anything unusual about the picture that's on this page, on this slide? Anyone?
He has 3 hands.
Yeah, he has 3 hands. And so I included this picture because I asked 3 different AI generators or agents to create an image of someone using their technology skills. And so Grok came up with this picture of this man using 3 hands, or using 3 hands. And maybe Grok has a sense of humor that they're saying that if you use technology wisely, it's like having an additional hand. Wouldn't that be nice? But what I think happened was this is a good example of AI coming back with a bad result or a faulty result. And so it might be a good reminder for us that, can't really trust everything AI says. You need to verify what you get from AI results. All right. Raquel's going to go ahead and take over on this slide and talk about ways that she has used the Vision Resource Center to address some of these issues.
Hi, everyone. So I felt very honored when Dan asked me to present with him. I've been, using the Vision Resource Center, and it feels like the more that you are searching it, that there's so many trainings and in a wide variety of topics that could be used for either professional growth or, like Dan said, for anybody within our team that we oversee that wants to grow in a certain area, whether to grow, or it could be something that we put out as meeting some goals, or supporting them with some deficiency. So one of the recent ones that I kind of went through and took was a conflict resolution one, which was for the beginner one. And I told Dan, God, it's so thorough and it has so many examples, and it just relates to when you think of conflict. It's like you feel this tightness in your stomach, but yet going through it, it really gives you some tools that you could keep in mind. And it's just a great resource to have, not just as managers, to also learn other programs that are within the college, that even if we don't work directly with it, we could still understand it and learn more. I told many other times for our employees, we don't have the money or resources to send everybody to any kind of trainings outside the district or conferences. So giving them, some direct guidance on areas. We recently were in the one that Dan just provided for customer service, and we kind of watched it as a team. And after the training we had with Dan, then we kind of sat together and kind of threw out ideas of what was it that we took away from that training and how can we implement it within our team. So those are some of the ideas that I found that we could relate to, or we could use these trainings for. And when Dan talked about the transcript, the nice thing about it is that as you go through these topics, you're taking some small quizzes to make sure that you are paying attention, you are going through it, and understanding the material. So then at the end, it provides you with your transcript of everything that you've taken through the Vision Resource Center. So it's really nice to even add it to any of your professional growth as you are learning, and all these new things that are coming out. It's a great way. So hopefully some of you guys could relate to some of these skills that could be implemented and as professional growth for yourselves or others.
Yeah, so you had mentioned conflict resolution. Were there any others that you had also participated in?
I have I think 19 that I've completed. It has on my little transcript, and some of them were also learning about DSPS. It's under the services that we provide here, but sometimes also understanding or being knowledgeable. So as managers, we also have to keep that in mind and keep an eye open to whether it's our facility or building, our students, are we meeting those guidelines and keeping up to date. So several of my other trainings that I've completed have been on that. Accessibility, the servant leader was another one I took. There's, I think, the CalWorks, even if we don't oversee those programs directly, we still should be knowledgeable about these areas because it all involves our students that we work with. So I find this tool really helpful, and sometimes it just takes an hour and a half, and just you focusing and learning more about it. So I've gone through a couple of them, and look forward to taking more of them.
That's great. And so Raquel, you mentioned servant leadership.
Yes.
There's just a plethora of other topics related to leadership. So here's a couple of them that might be helpful.
Yes, and I think that's for any depending on our administrative role, there's always room to grow and understand, or sometimes even a refresher, to make sure that we are dealing with situations that arise in the proper manner, and have these tools on hand to make sure that we are reacting and instead of trying to avoid things, learning how to address them at the moment. So the more that we're knowledgeable, the more that we're able to be more effective with our mental health, first of all, and everybody else around us. Um, so that's another area where I see it as uh, growing as a leader within ourselves and using these tools to do it.
Very good. I've had a boss or two that has managed by avoiding problems. So you don't recommend that then? Then
Of
that's
course not.
okay.
It's
Good.
it, like I said, the interesting one was that it was just a conflict resolution for beginners, and
Mm,
it was really diving into, and there's another one for managers. So I can imagine that second level because it just resonated with a lot of the way we grow up at, when we're a child. We've always grown up to kind of ignore it or not deal with it, and it just kind of follows us. So, like you said, Dan, we don't ignore it because then it could become a bigger problem, and that's the last thing we want.
right.
Or
Right.
friction at work. Yeah.
Yep. I agree. All right. Well, let's see. The fourth and last category then that we could search for topics are related to information about the California Community College system and higher education. And Raquel pointed out several. She mentioned DSPS. Um, what were some of the, accessibility and so forth. So here are some other potential hot topics that you could also check out. Um, can anyone think of any other uh, trainings or any other topics related to the California Community College system that you think might be appropriate to gain more knowledge on? So, like Carla might be interested in uh, workforce or um, some of the CTE requirements.
Yeah, I always forget the term for it, Dan. Um, it's like the targets. I always have to go to the chancellor's office, look up the book, look in the book, but I can't think of it as the criteria for the workforce goals.
Okay. Yeah.
But I also like the funding formula. I,
Oh, yes.
that one is a good one.
Yeah.
Mhm.
AB 1705. Absolutely. Yeah, Kim. Yeah. Funding formula. Very good. Okay, so here's what we'd like you to do at this point is we would like you to explore. And so maybe take, any one of those four categories or all of them. And what is a specific topic that you think would be relevant to you or that you think would be relevant to your staff? All right. So what we'd like you to do is to go ahead and take 5 to 10 minutes and explore those topics. And then let's come back together and we will then talk about some of those, some that you found interesting and seem like you want to, pursue more training on. And also think about different ideas of how you can capitalize on this resource for you or your staff. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and take some time and explore. Okay, well, let's come back together. And what did you find out? What were some interesting topics that you discovered or brainstorming some ways to use the Vision Resource Center?
I'll go.
Okay, thanks,
Um,
Carla.
Vanessa and I are sitting here and we were looking through the list and I don't know if you know, but Vanessa moved up into the assistant director role. And so we're looking at
Congratulations.
we do a pretty good job with, you know, working with our faculty and stuff. But one of my goals is really to work more closely with the classified staff. And so to implement some professional development for them. And so we looked at introduction to Excel data tools and data management. We do a lot of that in our department, tracking stuff for grants and such. And then micro learning for mental health awareness. There's a lot of need still in this day and age following COVID, and just a lot of stress within the department and the students and dealing with, you know, life in general. So we thought something like that would be good for mental health and wellness. And then dealing with a multi-generational workforce, because we have everything from the, you know, new generation to my really old generation. So those were a few samplings that we picked out.
That's great. Good. And if you would like to share your screen with us, we can do that. So anyone else? What else did you find that was intriguing?
Hi, Dan. This is Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi. I had started looking up some topics because I've been having conversations with all my staff about things that they might be interested in getting more information about, whether that be related to specifically our department or skills or information related to things that might apply to their job. So I used this time to kind of look up some of the topics that I got back from my staff. A big one was dealing with conflict and handling like de-escalation when you're dealing with someone who's upset. That was something that kind of across the board was something I think, and from our student workers all the way up to, you know, our full-time faculty and staff who've been here a long time, that was one that everybody thought would be really useful. And it looked like there was lots of different things through the Vision Resource Center that focused on that topic, which is really cool. So I'm going to definitely go back and find one that maybe I could show at one of our staff meetings that we can go through together, talk about how those things might apply when we're working with students and staff here on campus. Another one was that people wanted to spend some time talking about personal work wellness and taking care of yourself at work and just kind of overall stress. And so that was another one that seemed like there was a lot available on here that would probably cover a topic like that. And then again, my intention is to take the time during our scheduled staff meetings to do those things together, and then maybe be able to help each other apply some of those things, you know, on the daily when we're in the office. And so I'm going to go through, I have a long list of stuff here, but it looked like there was a lot available based off of what our staff wanted to see just to help with things for them personally or their job.
That's great. Wow. Very good, Stephanie.
And it really opens up the conversation, Stephanie, when instead of you're targeting, they don't feel like you're targeting someone. And it's like, if you take it as a group, then you go through the whole training. And at the end, you know, it's something that as a team, you go back and say, how can we implement this within this team, particularly because every location is different. We deal sometimes with different student or faculty or admin, you know, whatever the where your area of need is. So that's, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point, Raquel. And by doing it and at a staff meeting, then no one feels targeted as far as, you know, they're the ones who need the training specifically. What else? And by the way, every employee of our district should have access to the Vision Resource Center. So if they don't, if your staff does not, let me know, and I will see what I can do to get them that access. Now, student workers, though, I don't believe that they have access, but everyone else does.
You know, this is Gina. I agree with Stephanie. There's just so much here to go through. I know that my staff is going to love this, especially areas of, you know, the Excel and other areas in professional development. And my question, Dan, is, I know that Stephanie brought it up, you know, bringing it up in a setting of a, you know, staff meeting, but are we able to email these out to our employees? Like, hey, I found this great training.
I think so, in terms of at least obviously the title, but a link, though, let's see. Is there a share button? Oh, you can assign the training. However, when I tried to do that, it didn't work for me. So let's see. I'm trying it right now. And here, I'm going to show you what I'm doing. I'm sorry. All right, so what I did is I just selected a training, and then so let's say you want to do this one, or have one of your staff do this one. So if you do assign and then give it a due date and blah, blah, blah. And let's see. Let's try this. So let's say search. This. Yeah, so this hasn't worked for me, but you can try that. But again, you can go back to the training, and I would go ahead and grab this link and then send that link to whomever, Gina, and then they can, once they log into the Vision Resource Center, they should be able to paste it there and find it.
You know, I don't have that. I have the launch button, but I don't have the one for assign on mine.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm an administrator for the Vision Resource Center,
Okay.
so that must be just an admin feature.
Feature, right? Alrighty.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other topics that you discovered that you were intrigued with that we haven't talked about, or any other ways of using the Vision Resource Center?
I used it also to update some of my just on the Title V and the Title IX recently. You know, it's like just keeping up with some of the refreshing sometimes areas of refreshers to make sure we're
Yeah.
like you said, there's just so many topics to find,
Right.
but to have all of the tools where we know we could go into them and use them. Like I told Dan also, if we're mentoring somebody, sometimes we have staff that want to grow in certain areas, or you know, are looking for something, and this is a free tool out there for them as well, you know, guiding them in some of maybe the ones we've taken, and we just want to say, you know, how about you check this out, or even share this tool with them that they might not even know that it's available for them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. All right. Well, let's see. Jeffrey, you have a great responsibility of being a disciple of the Vision Resource Center up at Cerro Coso. So I deputize you to do that. and Raquel and I do. And then same with district office and here at BC, we'll get the word out that this is a, a valuable resource then for us and our students and staff. So students too. So, all right. Anything else then, Raquel? Or anyone else?
No, I think I just
Okay.
enjoyed it. And as well, you get a transcript with all the trainings that you do complete. So kind
Yeah.
of nice to keep updated.
Yeah.
Or
So
listen.
that could help, you know, in terms of if you had this as part of their employee performance review, that would be a way of documenting their completion. All right. Well, next month for the Lunch and Learn, we will, the topic will be imposter syndrome. And so we'll have a psychology professor and a staff member from one of our management association join in presenting that topic. And so stay tuned for that. And I think you'll really enjoy that one. And Leticia, did you have a comment you wanted to throw out?
I did. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, but you can't see me. I don't know what's going on with my camera, so I apologize.
no problem.
But you know, I'm fairly new to the district here, and you mentioned that this could be part of the employees' evaluation. How do we handle like the time to complete this aside from their normal business duties that they have on a daily basis? Like, how do you,
Right.
like, when would we suggest that they get these completed when we're
Right.
already so busy throughout the day? You know, so I'm just trying to figure out how that would work. If you have
Yeah,
any
no,
suggestions or
that's
ideas.
absolutely relevant. But I'm thinking that, you know, discussion with the employee of, you know, where can we find time in the week where you could dedicate to completing this training, or maybe it's over a 2-week period. You know, so if so maybe help them in identifying a time that is perhaps slower so that they could participate in the training, and then it may involve you know, having other staff kind of fill the gap while that employee is taking the training. Does anyone else have a suggestion as to help with that?
Hi, this is Gina. Maybe scheduling the trainings towards the end of the day, maybe 4:30 to 5:30.
Yeah.
Or maybe providing shorter trainings. Maybe I saw that there's 15, there's even 30 minutes to an hour long. So
Yes.
maybe finding a 30-minute training that they can take between 4:30 and 5:30.
Right. That's good.
That's perfect. Thank you to you both. Thank you.
Yes.
I just didn't want to make this like presented as another thing to do, and
Yeah.
you know, is
Right.
it gonna, you know, take away from, you know, the primary duties that, you know, someone is responsible for? So thank you. Appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, and like Raquel mentioned, you know, because of the job function, we may not be able to send our staff to conferences and other, you know, engaging learning opportunities. And so this is a low cost or no cost option, you know, for those staff. And, you know, maybe we should just mention you know, some reasons for providing professional development for our staff. One, it's a morale booster. And these are things I'm just thinking of at the top of my head. But two, the second thing is that I think it shows the employee that we value them. And let's see. I believe there are studies that show that employees who have been provided professional development, you're more likely to retain those employees. So those are just 3 reasons why you know, I think it's important that we do provide these professional development opportunities to all of our employees.
Whether it's a team or individual, like Dan said. And the nice thing is that many of them are not that long. which is, you know, like Dan said, investing in our, whether it's in, you know, sometimes where if you hold monthly meetings or every other week meetings, and sometimes there's short ones like mental health awareness or something, and it was like 7 minutes long. Something quick that you could also like a starting point of what you want to talk about. And sometimes if we really don't have anything to talk about, well, I will just cancel that meeting. But to have an area that will engage, you know, and be beneficial, not just to the staff, but to our students. The more that we are targeting certain areas, I think anywhere where we can improve and have access to this, where we're just, like Dan said, we don't have money to send everybody to these professional growths or conferences, but we have access to something that's free to us and engaging and buying a box of donuts, you know, on our staff meeting and having something like this presented. That's how I
Yeah.
would see.
Yeah, good idea. All trainings are better with donuts. So good tip.
Yes, thank you.
Jeffrey, did you want to say something?
Well, one of the things I'd bring up, I'm looking through here and I'm finding my old grant that I ran.
Really?
The presentations we had was in here, and I'm feeling bad because we haven't updated it for years. But they're actually very open to an individual that has expertise in a certain part of the community colleges to run your own class or presentation sometimes. They just consider you as a resource, and that's also kind of a professional development as well, because you're presenting and you're getting your contacts out there and meeting other people at other schools to see how they're doing things. So just an idea that the reverse is true. You can be a teacher as well as a student.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'll have to look for yours.
Yeah, that was the Alternate Text Production Center, which is mostly for, yes. So it might be kind of boring for you.
Very good, though. That's awesome.
You recorded it or not.
Good deal. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. We are halfway through our Wednesday, halfway through the week. So enjoy the rest of your week on the downside. So, all right, well, take care, and hope to see you next month.
All right, thanks.
Yes,
All right.
thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Raquel. Very good. I appreciate you being here and presenting. So
Yeah, and I think, you know, when it comes also to HR stuff, you know, one of the things that I did notice, you know, they're not that long.
Yeah, right.
Where we're not pulling somebody, you know, anything to benefit. And like you said, they feel acknowledged, noticed, and that we're willing to invest in
Right.
them.
Right.
So
Yep.
I
Yeah,
like that part
absolutely.
as well, how you
Yeah.
worded it. So.
Rebecca, thanks for hanging in there and coming back
Thanks.
in.
I have a quick question, like if you
Sure.
have a minute.
Yeah.
And this is because I'm in the Leadership Academy right now.
Okay.
So this is where my question's coming from. So our project that we're proposing is creating like a cohort for like DA3s and fiscal techs. And so we've kind of come up with like a pathway of what we'd like to do. And so I had originally thought, oh, we could embed LinkedIn Learning as part of the little components of, and so I'm thinking the vision research, well, I was get it wrong, the Vision Resource Center, right?
Right.
As part of that, but I just, I don't even remember what my question was, but I just was curious if you've done anything similar to that at all, I guess,
No, but I think it's a great idea. I think there are a lot of training opportunities that our DA3s could participate in.
Yeah, so because that's what like I've put together kind of like a pathway that I think would be interesting. Because like, you know, the information we're trying to align it with the non-credit really is what we're trying to do, so that a student, an employee could take it for non-credit, but then possibly do like CPL or CBE to get
Yeah.
units for it. So they can,
Absolutely.
you know, have different components on, you know, what would they need to do for CPL versus if they just took it for training.
Right.
But then that's when I was thinking like the certificates from the Vision Resource Center, like that would be kind
Yeah.
of cool as part of that in there.
Wow, Rebecca, you you gave me some interesting ideas. So maybe this is something that we should talk to Stacy about as far as, and maybe it's an HR, more of an HR issue,
Well,
but
and we are, so my group is meeting with Gina tomorrow.
oh, okay.
Because we
Oh,
are
good.
trying to look at, the cost, like cost for instruction, and because I'm really, like, my thought, like the pathway I put forward is really, I think the basic one was like information technology, because we have the information technology course, like at, say,
Hmm.
BC or Saracosa, like which is Excel and has different components in there. But what I'd like to do is customize it to actually be like our KCCD/BC Portable, Saracosa specific, like, so have like an introduction to Banner, have like software systems that
Oh,
when you get into
yes.
the job that you're like when I was A&R director at Taft, like, oh, we love that you have experience with Banner. Yeah, I was the front end user. So now I'm like building out the back end with no training, trying to seek it on my own. So I just think,
Right.
with these employees, like, so that was kind of my like wanting to do like IT and then leading that into, in fact, I have my pathway written down here somewhere. That I sent to my team, but basically kind of going from like IT into at some point leadership, and then like a basic business one, project management. So I have kind of a pathway of back to exactly the point you were talking about, retention. Retention
Yeah.
and, the three, like morale boosting, valuing them, but
Yeah.
also training within, so that people can see a pathway for promotion.
Yeah.
Anyways, I just was wondering if anything existed like that as we're
That's
creating
awesome,
it.
Rebecca. I'm so happy to hear that you're thinking about that and making a plan for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, our DA3s, especially at BC, boy, we lose them so
Oh,
quickly.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that's
And
what I experienced out at Taft, or they just
yeah,
didn't, the assumptions they have that experience and they don't, like, and they
yeah,
need it. And
right.
so to me, and that's really my pitch, is it needs to be during their workday. It needs to be,
Mm,
part of a professional development. Back to your point, we value you
mhm,
training. And
yeah,
what we are actually proposing is like a cohort. So we did have a IR do a survey for us. 117 responded, which was to me huge based on surveys.
wow,
Yeah, like I was shocked, like 117 actually, and this was fiscal tech and the DA3s.
that's
Um,
amazing.
and yeah, right? Because I've done surveys in the past, and it's like if you get
Yeah,
double digits, you're like thrilled.
right.
Yeah, yes.
But kind of like
Wow.
what I would love to do is kind of like following off a leadership academy, how you have, we're from different campuses. And so creating a cohort of DA3 fiscal techs that are from Porterville, BC, and having it be a synchronous/asynchronous
Mm,
learning, so that not only are they learning these skills, but they're also connecting with each other across campuses and
yeah,
can piggyback off each other on skill sets. And so anyways, so I just,
that's great.
And creating those connections, Rebecca, I think just like we do with the leadership,
yeah, it's huge.
from those
Mhm.
sides,
Yeah.
they
Mhm.
help each other. And like you said, building upon, we are in institutions that the opportunities are there,
Right.
but we also need to set like those pathways. Like I wanted to get to from this point to the next point, but how do I do it?
Mhm.
Or what should I do? What
Mhm.
resources,
Yeah.
and not feeling like you're just thrown also into a position, because many times that's what we do. There's nobody
Yeah.
to train us. We just
Yeah.
walk into a position.
Oh, totally. And I always laugh about it. Like, hey, how many of you had a Banner training?
Nope.
That
Yeah,
was hands-on.
right. Yep.
But yeah,
So that's kind of what I'm like saying, like, hey, we have these courses that we could, change from a 1 unit court to 1 unit credit to a non-credit, so that however the student wants to take it, or if they've already taken it, like say, then they could just, do a CPL credit towards that certificate or whatever. But
Right.
so anyways, that's what my team, that's what we're doing. So I'm sitting here and I'm messaging my team on the back and going, oh my gosh, I was thinking LinkedIn Learning, but actually Vision Resource Center would be great.
Awesome.
Tie
Very
in.
good.
So,
Oh, I hope that takes off, Rebecca.
yeah,
It's
we
a
present to the board, I think in April. So
okay.
we'll let you
Good
know.
deal. Yeah. Fantastic.
So, but yeah, thank you for these. These are always great.
Good, good. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks. Have a
Yeah.
good day. Bye.
All right, everybody. Well, take care. Bye-bye.
yeah. So it's great to hear all these conversations.